I actually did a speed reading course. I taught a speed reading course for my dad. And maybe that's, I'm not sure where he picked it up. But that's another topic, isn't it? I'm supposed to today talk about the whole brain approach to learning and thinking. But probably I should say the whole brain approach to learning and thinking and reading, because this is a book fair. But I have actually myself written 6 books, and I brought the last 2 along as a sample. And so I have one here, which of course probably from the distance you can't see, but there's a brain on the front of the book. Okay, so most people think that this is sort of neuroscience or something like that. Well, actually it is neuroscience, but in a very easy, practical, amateurish way. What I would just like to find out is how many people in the audience are in education, educators, teachers. Could I have a show of hands? Oh, very, very few. Okay, so the rest of you, we're not sure what you are. But anyway, because I think what we say is, when we're born, are we born thinking or are we born learning? Which comes first? Learn to think or think to learn? It's a bit like that story this morning, wasn't it? The chicken or the egg. But actually, the brain and the human being is a learning machine. And the moment, well, maybe not that very first minute of life, but within, the first few hours of life, we are actually learning already. Some people will actually say we're learning while we're still in the mother's womb. And so yes, there is an element of learning that takes place even before we're born. But the brain is still maturing, and the brain has only partially matured around puberty, when the left hemisphere, I think we all know whole brain means the left and the right together, okay? So if the left hand represents the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, put them together, okay, and put your fists together. And your fists, when put together, is about the same size as the brain you have. So if you have big hands, you have a big brain, right? Small hands, small brain. Correct? Small head, small brain. And therefore small hands. But the size of the brain doesn't matter, okay? It's what you do with the brain and how the brain works. So don't sort of get all worried because you're a small person with a small head and small hands that you have a small brain. It's how you use it. And of course there are various discussions about do we only use 2% of our brain or 3% of our brain or 10% of our brain. There's actually a lot of myths around this, because just earlier you went to have some, hopefully you got some makan, okay, some minum, and if I was to ask you now, what did you eat? Well, if I was even to ask you tonight when you go home, write down what you had for morning tea, or write down what you had for lunch, and of course maybe afternoon tea, but perhaps before dinner. How much could you remember? Now, it may be the more tasty it is and the more things you tried out, you will remember more. So learning is actually enhanced when we use more of our senses, multisensory if you will. And the various senses we have, I think we know them all, except perhaps the sixth sense, the mysterious one. But all the senses, when we sense, when we smell, taste, touch, feel, see, all that information initially goes into our emotional brain, something called the limbic system. which actually in terms of size is only about 10% of the mass of the brain. But think of the emotional brain as your turbocharged brain. Okay, if some of you know, about turbochargers in a motor car. The motor car engine itself is very big, isn't it?
Yeah.
But how big is the turbocharger? Very small, but it makes all the difference to the power and the drive of the car. So firstly, what we want to appreciate is that our emotional brain actually is very, very important, very powerful, and it kicks in before our rational thinking and what Dante was calling the critical thinking brain or the creative thinking brain. So we need to understand the emotions. So a lot of my book is addressing what today sometimes we call emotional intelligence, okay, or EQ as it's quite well known. And some of the books I've written have been on leadership and management, but more on learning and the brain, but quite a lot on culture, because my wife is a cultural anthropologist. She has also written 5 books, but in the process of writing the 6th. So in order to keep ahead, I've got to write one more very soon, haven't I? But the cultural component of how we learn is very important. What we might call, we call it nurture rather than nature. Okay, but our genetic self, what makes us the personality we are, the traits that we have, the strong traits that we have, these tend to be more nature, more genetic. So, of course, our behavior is a product of both. So we may be naturally very curious when we're young, but we go to school and then we want to ask the teacher lots of questions. That's partly why I wanted to find out how many teachers here. And the idea is that we don't, or the teacher doesn't have enough time to entertain all the questions from these young, curious children. So as you program yourself through school, as you progress through school, you learn not to ask questions. So then you go home and you say, "Mummy," or "Daddy," and you have some questions. And they say, "Go and ask the other person." So if you ask Mama, oh, go and ask Daddy. If you ask Daddy, go and ask Mama. Or, what is the other question? Sorry, too busy. Maybe later. So slowly, we grow up to learn not to ask lots and lots of questions. But that's actually one of the key elements to learning. So what we can do, however, is if the parents or the teachers won't answer all the questions, we go to the book. So then we need to build up our library. And that's actually one way to encourage kids to learn, is when they ask you a question, it says, "Well, before I answer it, see if you can find the answer for yourself. Here are a couple of books. Go through the books, see if you can answer the question yourself." So you're starting to, create not only a reading habit, but a critical thinking and a learning habit all together. So all I'm saying now then is the whole brain approach to why we learn and why we think is that we use both sides of the brain. But we also use our emotional brain as well as our thinking brain, our cognitive self. And the thinking brain is called the cerebral cortex. And if you ever studied the anatomy of the brain, you would know that that actually represents some 80% of our brain. And remember, only 10% is the emotional. Now, 80 and 10 leaves, it comes to 90, so you probably want to know what is the other 10%. And that is something called our instinctive brain. It's the reptilian brain. It's the snake and the crocodile in us, okay? It doesn't think. And it's not split into a left and a right. So that one